In this live stream, we'll compare React state management between class components and function components. So here I have a code sandbox created, and this is based off of the Create React App template, the latest one. And let's get straight into it. So first of all, let's create a basic class component. And what I'll do is I'll import class from class. The file hasn't been created yet. Class like this. And of course, excuse me for the the creative naming of this component. The only reason I'm naming it class with a K is because there are certain reserved words in JavaScript where we can't use, like class and function, for example. So once I save this, we should see an error because class is not found. So I will create that file right now. So for the class component, first things first, let's import React. And then let's also import the component from React. And so for the latest Create React app, you probably don't need to import React. However, I'm only doing it, to follow the previous Create React app functionality. And so let's export our default, our class, name class, and then our class extends off of the React component. Just like that. Perfect. And so first things first, let's just render. So a class component requires a single render method. And here, let me return an h1 that says class. This way we can make sure that it's rendered correctly. Actually, let me remove this as well since I have the member imported. And boom, we have class. Perfect. And so to set up state here, if you follow the official React docs, you will notice that they will ask you to create a constructor. And in the constructor, we have props. And then what we want to do is we want to super the props like that. And then here we do this.state. And then we create an object for our initial state. And let's follow the example of creating a button with a counter. And so here I have a count property, and let's set it to default to 0. And then once we have that, let's just create a button over here. And then we will render this.state.count. Just like that. And let's save it. And you'll see our button with a 0. Very nice. And then so if we want to add state, meaning add an action that can increment the counter whenever we click on it, we can create a class method. Let's call it handleClick. And what this handleClick will do is it will do a this.setState. And setState is a property that React provides on the component. And then we will set the count property to this.state.count plus 1. And you'll notice that we do it like this to ensure that there are no side effects, that we are not incrementing count on the actual object itself. And this way it is pure and actually returns an actual value. And so this is not done. So if we save it and we try to click on the button, you'll notice that it doesn't work. And that's because the this context isn't bound correctly. So generally, you'll notice that you'll do something like this dot the method handleClick, and then you do this dot handleClick dot bind this. And then when you save it, and then you refresh, you will see that it is still not working. Interesting. Okay, so handleClick, did I spell this correctly? HandleClick, then do a this.setState, count. This seems correct as well. Oh, and I forgot, of course, we never added our onClick event handler. So onClick this dot handle click. And then when we save it, now it will increment. Great. And so generally, this is the syntax. Of course, you know, in your later projects, if you're using the latest syntax, ES6, whatnot, you generally don't need the constructor. What you might actually see is you're using setting state on it as a class property, just like that. And then the handle click, instead of having to bind this, you simply refactor the handle click to an arrow function, just like that. And if you save it, you'll notice that it still works. And so this is probably the syntax that you're generally familiar with. And so let's see how it looks like for an actual function component. So what we'll do here is let's call our class function. As you see, I'm being creative once again. Of course, for your class, you can name it whatever you like. And let me create a new file, function.js. And look here, we're doing kind of the same thing. So we do import React. And then you'll notice here, I'm also importing useState, which I will talk about later. And then for functions, it's pretty simple. You want to export default, your function, and your function will be called function like this. We don't have any props, but generally that first argument is for props. And you want to return. So there's no render because in a function you can only return. And let's return. Here you see I'm using a fragment, a React fragment, and that's just so I don't have to add a placeholder div, render div in there. So let's add our h1 heading with function just like that. And let's just save it to make sure it renders. Perfect. And so how does state work in functions? Here they have the concept of hooks, and I'll just show you real quick. This is the React documentation on hooks, and as you can see, it's added since 16.8. And you know, to kind of refactor the class and apply it similar to the function component, you know, let's use some similar syntax so it looks familiar. So with useState, what the useState hook does is it takes an initial state value, and then it returns an array. You can think of it like a tuple, although JavaScript doesn't support tuples, but think of it as an array with two items. The first one is the state, and the second one is the setState method or function. And so you can use array destructuring. So you can do const, and then you have state, and then setState, just like that, equals useState, and then your initial value. And so to keep it kind of in parity or similar to the class component example, I will create a variable for initial state, just like that. And the initial state will be an object, and count will be 0. So I'll pass it in here, initial state, and then I will create a button, just like here as well. And then I will render state.count. And then if I save it, you'll notice that it renders 0, which is our initial state. Awesome. And then to add a event handler, so let's do onClick. Let's call this handle click as well over here. This time you'll notice that we have a function. So of course there's no class properties or methods this time. So we'll create a function, handle click, just like that. And then what we want to do is we simply call setState. And then we can pass in count, similar to how the class component does it, and then state.count plus 1, just like that. And then so if you click here, you'll see that it works as intended. And so, essentially, kind of the key differences between those two is that with the hooks, in functions, you want to use the useState hook. And what it does is it keeps track of the state when it after renders. So the initial state gets set first, but then every time an additional render, it knows the previous or the current state, and that's what it uses. And that's pretty much kind of the key similarities or differences between class components and function components regarding React state management. One thing that's food for thought is that with class components, this dot state or on the class property is always an object. However, in function components, you'll notice that I set the initial state as an object just to keep it similar in the class example, but you can technically refactor this to a value. So let me just show you that real quick. So let me rename this from initial state to initial count, set this to 0. Just like that. And then instead of state, rename refactoring this to count. So now this is an actual value. It's not an object anymore, it's a number. And then I will go to all places that have state and delete it. And then for the set state, you can just do set count, just like that. And if you save it, you'll see that the object is not, because I made another boo-boo here, it's not an object anymore. So set count will take a number as the value. So just clicking on it, you'll see it still works as intended. And so that's one of the nice things about, function state as hooks, is that it could take any primitive JavaScript value instead of having to just use objects. And just to make sure that the class components still work as intended, it does just like that. And that's pretty much a basic overview between React class and React functions in regards to just handling state. And you might be asking, hey, should I be using class components or function components? Class components are still here to stay. They're not going to be deprecated anytime soon. But I would definitely say do adopt function components. It's simpler, it's more straightforward, and it's not bad. It's pretty good. So that's it for this stream. I will catch you in the next one.